This is an essay about a word, but it is also about our world. The word is genocide. For over 2 years, a brutal war has raged in Gaza. Millions have watched the horror unfold. From the very beginning, Western leaders, particularly in the UK and the US, were clear. They backed Israel's right to defend itself. They sent weapons and offered political cover. They refused to use that one powerful word. They told us it was a complex conflict, a tragic war, but not genocide. Now the ground is shifting beneath our feet. Suddenly the debate has changed. This essay asks a simple question. Why? Why, after so long, is the conversation about Gaza changing in the West? What happened to the solid wall of support for Israel's actions? I will explain what the old position was. I will show you what has changed. We will look at the hard facts and the key reports that leaders could no longer ignore. We will explore the reasons for this pivot, high-level politics, the power of ordinary people, and we will consider what this shift means for justice, for international law, and for all of us. This is not just about words. It is about whether our leaders will finally face the truth. For a long time, the official Western story was simple. The violence began on October 7, 2023. Hamas launched a horrific attack. Israel, they said, had no choice but to respond. This narrative was repeated by prime ministers and presidents. It was broadcast on news channels. It shaped how millions understood the unfolding catastrophe. But a different story was always there, told by Palestinians on the ground. It was a story of decades of occupation, of a crushing siege, and of a people being erased. Now, that story is breaking through. Let's be clear about what we are discussing. This is not about taking sides in an abstract debate. It is about whether international laws, created after the Holocaust to prevent the ultimate crime, mean anything at all. The shift in language we are witnessing is not a minor detail. It could be the difference between accountability and impunity. It could determine whether the killing stops. So we must ask the hard questions. We must demand honest answers. And we must understand the forces that are finally making a change. In the days and months after October 7, 2023, the Western political establishment spoke with one voice. From Washington to London, the message was unwavering support for Israel. President Joe Biden stood shoulder to shoulder with Israeli leaders, even repeating unverified and inflammatory claims about the Hamas attacks. In the UK, Keir Starmer, then leader of the opposition and now Prime Minister, went on the radio and appeared to defend Israel's right to cut off water and power to Gaza. This was the consensus. It was a political and moral green light for the devastation that followed. This support was not just rhetorical, it was material. The United States rushed billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. The UK continued to license arms sales. Any criticism of Israel's methods was dismissed as naive or worse, as support for terrorism. The suffering of Gaza's civilians was framed as a tragic but unavoidable consequence of fighting an enemy that used human shields. This was the official story, and it was a powerful one. Behind this political wall stood a media environment that largely reinforced the official line. Influential commentators and powerful newspapers echoed the language of government. The conflict was framed as a simple binary civilization versus barbarism. Piers Morgan, on his widely watched show, consistently defended Israel's military campaign. He argued that the blame for every civilian death lay with Hamas. This view dominated the airwaves, creating a feedback loop. Politicians felt secure in their stance because the media told them the public was behind them. It was a closed circuit of justification. This consensus was built on a foundation of long-standing alliances and shared interests. For decades, the West has viewed Israel as a key strategic partner in a volatile region. Military and intelligence ties run deep, but it was also built on a narrative that deliberately erased the context. The 16-year blockade of Gaza, the illegal occupation of Palestinian land, the daily indignities and violence of apartheid. All of this was missing from the story. The clock was started on October 7th. Everything before was forgotten. While leaders and mainstream media presented a united front, a different reality was being documented. From the very start, Palestinian journalists, Palestinian citizens, risked their lives to show the world what was happening. Using social media, they broadcast images of unimaginable destruction. They shared stories of entire families wiped out by airstrikes. This torrent of evidence began to sow seeds of doubt. People saw with their own eyes. Flattened neighborhoods, overflowing hospitals, starving children. It became harder to believe the official narrative that this was a precise war against terrorists. Then, human rights organizations began to speak out. These were respected mainstream bodies. Human Rights Watch published detailed reports. They documented evidence of war crimes, warned the siege was a form of collective punishment, illegal under international law. In July 2025, a crucial moment arrived. B'Tselem Physicians for Human Rights. Israel declared Israel was committing the crime of genocide in Gaza. This was a milestone. Respected Israeli voices now making the claim. Include close-up of UN report cover, Gaza Genocide, a collective crime. These reports from civil society groups created the first cracks in the wall of Western denial. They provided a foundation of credible, fact-based evidence. Activists and solidarity movements seized on these findings, organized massive protests in cities across the West. The public conversation began to shift. The word genocide was being spoken more loudly and more often, yet Western governments held the line. They dismissed the reports. They questioned the motives of the human rights groups. In the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Foreign Secretary David Lammy explicitly rejected the genocide label. In his September 2025 letter, he stated that the war did not meet the criteria for genocide. Other European nations, the Netherlands, Greece, also refused to use the term, deferring to future court rulings. The political establishment was digging in, hoping they could wait out the storm. But the storm was about to break. The moment the Western establishment had dreaded finally came in the autumn of 2025. The United Nations, the world's highest international body, delivered its verdict. On September 16, 2025, the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory released its findings. The conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The Commission ruled that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. This was not the opinion of one expert. It was the formal finding of a UN-mandated investigative body. It carried immense legal and moral weight. The dam of denial had broken. Just a few weeks later, in October 2025, another hammer blow fell. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, published her report. It was titled, Gaza Genocide, a Collective Crime. Albanese went further than the Commission. She detailed the evidence for Israel's genocide. She also pointed the finger directly at the nations that had enabled it. Many states, primarily Western ones, she wrote, have facilitated, legitimized, and eventually normalized the genocidal campaign. She accused them of being complicit. The UN was now officially saying that Western powers had blood on their hands. The impact of these UN reports cannot be overstated. They stripped away the last vestiges of legitimacy from the Western position. It was no longer possible for leaders like Keir Starmer to claim there was no credible evidence. The United Nations itself had provided it. The reports confirmed what Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights groups had been saying for months. They affirmed the lived reality of the people of Gaza. The highest authorities on international law had spoken. The debate was no longer about whether it was happening, but about who would be held responsible. Of course, Israel and its staunchest allies immediately rejected the findings. Israel's UN ambassador called Albanese's report poison. Western governments tried to downplay the reports, suggesting they were biased or one-sided. But the damage was done. The UN's conclusions became front-page news. They gave opposition parties, journalists, and activists an official authoritative source to cite. Reason 1. The geopolitical game. One of the key reasons for the West's sudden pivot is a cold, hard geopolitics. For 2 years, Western nations had calculated that the benefits of supporting Israel outweighed the costs. This calculation was based on maintaining a strategic ally in the Middle East and containing regional rivals. However, as the war dragged on and the death toll mounted, the costs began to spiral. The conflict was destabilizing the entire region, threatening vital shipping lanes and sparking proxy conflicts. The West's unwavering support for Israel was alienating key Arab and Muslim majority nations, whose cooperation is needed on everything from counter-terrorism to energy security. The world is changing, you know. The unipolar moment is over. Rising powers like China and a resurgent bloc of global South nations are offering an alternative to Western dominance. These countries were largely united in their condemnation of Israel's actions and the West's complicity. By standing with Israel against a global consensus, the UK and the US found themselves increasingly isolated. They were losing influence at the United Nations. They were seen not as defenders of a rules-based order, but as hypocrites who applied international law selectively. This growing isolation started to have real-world consequences: diplomatic protests, threats of trade boycotts, and new economic blocs. Leaders in London and Washington began to realize their hardline stance was damaging their long-term strategic interests. A pivot, even a small one, became necessary. Changing their language on Gaza was a low-cost way to signal to the rest of the world that they were listening. Furthermore, the war was exposing deep divisions within the West itself. While the UK, US, and Germany held a firm pro-Israel line, other European countries like Spain, Ireland, and Belgium were becoming increasingly critical. This disunity weakened the European Union and NATO. For the sake of Western cohesion, a new consensus was needed. The pivot was partly an internal adjustment, a classic geopolitical recalibration. Governments do not operate in a vacuum. They have to face their own people. In democracies, public opinion is a powerful force, and for 2 years, the public had been on a journey. The constant stream of horrific images from Gaza, amplified by social media, had a profound effect. People who had never thought much about Palestine were now confronted with the human cost of the conflict daily. This grassroots awareness fueled one of the largest and most sustained protest movements in recent history. Week after week, hundreds of thousands marched in London, New York, Berlin, demanding a ceasefire and justice for Palestinians. This public pressure began to translate into political pressure. Voters, especially young people, were becoming deeply alienated from mainstream political parties that supported the war. In the UK, the Labour Party, under Keir Starmer, faced a potential rebellion and a significant loss of support in Muslim communities and among progressive voters. Politicians started to see that their stance on Gaza could cost them their seats. This is the language that leaders understand best. The fear of losing elections can concentrate the mind wonderfully. The pivot was, in part, a survival strategy. The media landscape also played a crucial role. While much of the corporate media initially followed the government's lead, the persistence of alternative media, independent journalists, and social media activists created a parallel narrative that could not be ignored. This alternative narrative was powered by facts, evidence, and raw human testimony. Eventually, some mainstream outlets had to start covering it, if only to maintain their own credibility. As the evidence of atrocities mounted, it became journalistically indefensible to ignore it. This shift in media coverage helped to legitimize the protesters' concerns and bring them into the living rooms of millions. For a time, politicians believed that being tough and pro-Israel was a vote winner. But as the war's brutality became undeniable, that position began to look less like strength and more like cruelty. It became a political liability. The moral argument had finally merged with the political argument. Reason 3. The moral and legal reckoning. Beyond geopolitics and domestic politics, there is a third crucial reason: the inescapable weight of law and morality. The Genocide Convention places a solemn duty on all signatory states, including the UK and the US, to prevent and punish genocide. For 2 years, Western leaders argued the legal bar had not been met. They hid behind legal jargon and procedural delays. But the UN reports from September and October 2025 made that position untenable. When the UN's Commission of Inquiry formally rules a genocide is being committed, it triggers legal obligations. States can no longer claim ignorance. Continuing to provide weapons and diplomatic cover exposes the provider to the charge of complicity, a crime under international law. Western leaders suddenly face the real risk of personal legal jeopardy. They could, in theory, be prosecuted. That threat of legal accountability is a powerful motivator. The moral argument also became impossible to ignore. The deliberate starvation of a population, the destruction of hospitals and universities, the dehumanizing language used by some Israeli officials. Together, these pointed toward clear genocidal intent. Western leaders who preach human rights were exposed as hypocrites. Their moral authority was collapsing. The media is never just a neutral observer. It is an active participant in shaping our reality. In the initial phase of the war, a large section of the Western media acted as a megaphone for the state. They uncritically repeated government talking points. They centered Israeli voices and perspectives, marginalizing or discrediting Palestinian ones. The narrative was simple. Israel was the victim, acting in self-defense. This framing was the result of decades of established practice, cozy relationships, and a shared ideological outlook. However, as the war ground on, this monolithic narrative began to fracture. Palestinian journalists continued to report despite being killed in unprecedented numbers. Their work, disseminated globally via social media, provided a constant, undeniable counter-narrative. Another reason was the work of independent media and citizen journalists who fact-checked official claims and exposed bias. They built a community of viewers who were hungry for a more honest account of the war. The turning point for many in the media came with the official reports from the UN and respected human rights organizations. When B'Tselem, and then the UN itself, used the word genocide, it became a major news story. It gave journalists the institutional backing they needed to ask tougher questions. Editors could no longer forbid its use. The Overton window, the range of ideas the public will tolerate, had shifted. The media was both a cause and a consequence of this shift. We should not be naive. The pivot in media coverage has not been universal or complete. Powerful right-wing media outlets continue to push the old narrative, defending Israel unconditionally and smearing its critics. Yet, the consensus is broken. On news channels and in liberal newspapers, you now hear a more diverse range of views. You see debates about whether Western support constitutes complicity. Some high-profile commentators have softened their tone or even changed their minds. This media pivot gives the public permission to rethink their own views. This shift in words is not just an abstract debate. It has real, tangible consequences for everyone involved. First, it directly affects policy and law. As more Western nations begin to acknowledge the reality of what the UN has named a genocide, the pressure to change policy will become immense. This could mean suspending arms sales to Israel, It could mean imposing sanctions on Israeli officials responsible for atrocities. It could mean lending active support to cases at the International Court of Justice. It could mean lending active support to cases at the International Criminal Court. Words like genocide unlock legal and political tools that were previously off the table. Second, the pivot has huge implications for public trust. For 2 years, citizens were told one thing by their leaders while they saw another with their own eyes. This has created a massive credibility gap. People feel lied to. They see their governments as complicit. This erodes faith in our political institutions, in our media, and in the very idea of a rules-based order. Rebuilding that trust will be a monumental task. The longer leaders deny the obvious, the deeper the cynicism and alienation will become, with dangerous consequences for the health of our democracies. Third, this has consequences for Israel itself. Unconditional support from the West allowed the most extreme elements, without facing any real costs. A shift in the Western stance could force a painful but necessary reckoning within Israel. It could empower those voices in Israeli society who have long argued for peace and equal rights. Finally, and most importantly, it has consequences for the people of Gaza. For them, this is not a theoretical discussion. It could mean the difference between life and death. It could mean the arrival of sufficient humanitarian aid to end the man-made famine. It could mean an end to the bombing. It could mean a chance to rebuild their lives and their society. It could mean that the world finally recognizes their humanity and their right to exist. This is the ultimate stake in this debate. Justice for the people of Gaza depends on the world moving from a pivot in words to a revolution in actions. We have seen how the solid wall of Western support for Israel's war in Gaza has begun to crumble. For 2 long years, leaders in the UK, leaders in the US, leaders elsewhere denied reality. They provided the weapons, the money, and the diplomatic cover for a campaign that has inflicted unimaginable suffering. They refused to use the word genocide, but the truth has a way of getting out. It was carried in the testimony of Palestinian survivors, documented by courageous human rights workers, and finally, confirmed by the United Nations itself. The official narrative could no longer hold against the weight of evidence. The pivot we are now witnessing is the result of many forces. It is about geopolitics and the West's fear of isolation in a changing world. It is about domestic politics and the power of ordinary people marching, protesting, and demanding better from their leaders. And it is about the inescapable force of morality and international law, which places a duty on all of us to prevent the ultimate crime. The media, after a shameful start, has slowly begun to reflect this new reality, creating more space for an honest public debate. But we must be cautious. A pivot in language is not the same as a change in action. It is easy for politicians to adopt new words to calm public anger while continuing the same deadly policies in private. The true test is what comes next. Will the arms sales stop? Will there be sanctions? Will our governments throw their full weight behind international justice? Or is this just a tactical rebranding of complicity? We, the public, have a vital role to play in ensuring it is the former. We must continue to push, to question, and to demand that actions match words. The story of Gaza is a story of immense tragedy, but it is also a story of incredible resilience and the power of truth.